In this video, we're going to disassemble the PTO assembly. A couple things here. This pulley has always been loose. The nut already broke loose, but even with the nut tight, the pulley moves around. So it's either going to be worn or the shaft. I do have another shaft. I do not have another pulley. Inside the gearbox itself isn't too bad. This gear is a little worn where it engages with the gear on the input shaft of the transmission. A little bit of sludge in there. I already had the hydraulic pump off because I had to remove it to get access to a couple of the bolts when I was taking this off of the tractor. It worked. It did seep down a little over time. This is a later Model B, so it has the larger PTO shaft. Alright, first thing I'm going to remove is this pulley. So that's pretty stiff the whole way. With it being loose, I imagine it'll slide off easy. There's some paint inside of that taper, so maybe it's not worn out too bad. I don't know. I'll have to see how that fits on the other shaft. Keyway's pretty ate up. On these threads, it looks like there's a good bit that weren't even used. So maybe the nut was just never tight. A little bit of play in the bearings. Alright, from here, without disassembling anything else, we can see a few things kind of important. This bearing back here supports the back end of the transmission input shaft. There is a race on the input shaft that rides in there. This part is to engage and disengage the PTO. It sits in a groove on a gear or on the back of the input shaft, and it slides the gear back and forth to engage the gear with this gear. This tube here is pretty important. This tube is for lubrication. When you're driving the tractor, your differential spinning, and the gear on the differential is going to scoop up oil and throw it into this tube. This tube goes back into the casting, and it fills this cavity behind here with oil. It might have passageways to some of the other bearings too in there. I don't know, but I know it supplies oil to that bearing for sure. I'll show you this on the back of the transmission real quick. This is the race that rides inside of that bearing. It supports this end of the shaft. This shaft shouldn't be this loose. There's a issue with the transmission here. And this is the gear that engages the PTO or disengages the PTO. And your differential here, it spins back this way towards us. And that tube sits over here, so the differential can splash oil into that tube to lubricate the bearing. Alright, on this hydraulic pump, we have two fittings here. One fitting went to the front for the cultivators, the other fitting to to the hydraulics in the back that had a snap coupler set up. There's a rod that would go here. This would raise your hydraulics. This would be hold. This would let it down. Or I could have that backwards. It's hard to see with the linkage hooked up. So this is loose. I've already had this off when we disassembled the tractor in that first video. Okay. On the inside, we have a pickup tube and a couple very crusty rollers. The rollers on the parts tractor are perfect, so I'm sure I'll probably just end up using that pump if it works. The way this pump works, you have a camshaft that's going to push these plungers and operate the pistons down here. Let's see if we get a better view of that cam inside of there. Okay, so this camshaft inside of here is attached to the PTO. So the PTO would have to be on for the hydraulics to work. It looks like there's been some issues here, which may not help when it comes time for me to take it apart. So two things I see. One, this camshaft section is worn out pretty good. You can see a little edge here where the cam lobe is worn down. But also somebody welded that gear on. That's going to suck to remove. I'll tell you what, that cam lobe is worn. That taper on that other shaft is possibly worn. This gear is worn. I think at this point, I am not going to waste my time taking this PTO apart any further. I'll end up using the parts PTO. So I will just get the parts PTO to this point and continue the teardown video on that one. Alright, got the parts PTO mounted up on the stand. Just a quick walk around. This one is in much better shape. Only thing I see at the moment is not real bad. The shaft's got a couple bends in it. It's not super straight, but the other one's perfect, so I will probably pull that off of the other. More importantly, no welds, and our camshaft is in pretty good shape. I don't have the pump over here with me right now, but the little rollers and all that on the pump look perfect. Next step, we're going to remove this PTO shield here. Alright, nothing too special about this. A little crusty, but solid. Have one more bolt to get the seal retainer off the back. Can't find my brass hammer, so I guess this plastic one will have to work. Okay. Got some shims behind here, so that tells us that this plate is also used to control the depth of this bearing race to control preload on this shaft. And that'll, I don't think it slid out any. Just got a little bit of end play here. So that seal's definitely not original. That's been replaced for sure. A couple shims. There's a bunch in here. I don't see any on this, but this has been apart, so there's no telling. On the transmission, I noticed in the manual for it, I noticed that they put paper between these to help seal it. So when we do remove this shaft, it's going to come out this end. Hopefully. That's a pretty good wear right there. Yeah, it's pretty good groove there. It's smooth, but it's definitely worn. Okay, so looking at removing the shaft out the back, I don't see anything any set screws or anything that holds the gear in place, so I assume I'm supposed to drive that shaft through the gear by pushing on it on this end. It looks like this side shaft would hold that gear in place, but maybe not evenly. I'll try it a little bit. If it moves easy, we'll go with it. If not, we'll regroup and figure out a way to hold that gear in place. Okay, so I tapped it a little bit with a brass punch and then realized I forgot to turn the camera on. It did not seem to move the shaft in the gear. So I'm going to try something here. I have a block of wood against the gear with a screw going through the housing, pressing the block of wood tighter against the gear. And I'll put a little wedge here just in case, and then we'll tap on it and see if it goes through. What I'm looking at now is to see if I get any kind of gap between that shaft and the gear, right where that other one was welded. I want to see if the shaft is moving at all. It's not moving yet. It's moving a little bit. Need to reposition this block of wood, regroup a little there. That bolt I had was just going through the board, so I loosened it up and put a flat piece of steel there up against the board. Thing here is we have to drive the shaft through that bearing race also, and those are usually pretty tight. Maybe we should regroup here. Let me look at the shop manual just to see if there's something I'm missing. Alright, digging into the shop manual. You're supposed to get a 2-jaw puller and grab this gear, top and bottom, and press this shaft through. I do not have a 2-jaw puller that actually fits behind the top here, so even if I angle it, it doesn't go quite right. So we'll regroup and figure out another way, or buy a puller. We got some movement out of it before, just tapping on it, so maybe it just wasn't solid enough on that stand. I'm gonna try a little bit right here. I have one of the old cylinder sleeves underneath, holding it up by the case. It's going. It's a good sign. Board's still holding the gear flush. We're not beating up against that one too bad. That would have been the race falling on the bearing on the other side. And it's out. Part that fell on the floor. Erase. Doesn't look like it's in too bad a shape. Cam lobes look a lot better than that other one. Obviously, we don't have any welds here too, so that's good. So this is where the gear pressed on. This is where the bearing sat on the end. Alright, here's the bearing for the front of that. This gear slides out the front. So this bevel gear runs the side shaft with a pulley on it. And on this top gear, this is where that gear slides off the input shaft and engages here. This looks like it's in great shape. And this was just a piece of metal I was using to put the bolt against so it wouldn't crack the wood anymore. On this shaft, I need to remove this nut to pull this gear off and drive the shaft out the end. The shaft's got a pretty good bit of end play also. Have to look at these bearings real close because the end play comes from somewhere. It's usually bearing wear. But since this thing has been dug into before, it could be it just wasn't put together right and shimmed right in the first place. So forgot to turn on the camera there. But I put a punch on the end and tapped it once, and the splined gear popped off. Yeah, it's going. Maybe this end will be more interesting. Hopefully it doesn't fly all the way out and land on the ground. It's kind of milky. Dang! It actually landed on part of the camera stand, so it saved the end of the shaft. We'll come back and look at this in just a second. Alright, so this is what the shaft looks like. That's the pulley side. And the gear side. This bearing sits right about there. And it looks to me like the only way to adjust the bearing preload is to tighten down on that nut. I don't see any shims anywhere, unless there's some behind the races. We'll check that out too. They look in decent shape. I'll need to clean everything and check it better. So next step, we're going to move this PTO engagement shaft and arm and detent. And there's a detent ball behind here that has a really strong spring behind it. There's no access from the other side, so I assume that's just going to fly out. But earlier, I accidentally shifted this too far, and the ball didn't come completely out, but it came out a pretty good bit, and it took a lot of effort to get it back in there. All right, first step, get rid of this wire. We got some wire here that's tied on it to keep it from working its way loose. and falling into the gear train. Pretty sure they put that there for a reason, so maybe that's happened. It's definitely going back. Oh wow, that's real loose. Oh. Okay, so right now I am pressing inwards to keep the ball from flying, the detent ball, and I'm moving the shaft back and forth, and just the spring pressure itself is sliding this off. Okay, we're good. Come on out of there, really? There we go. Okay, so there's a detent spring, detent ball. These are the spots it rides, so when you engage or disengage the PTO, it holds it there. Shaft comes out. Nothing real special here. It doesn't even look like there's a seal on it. So what I'll do is put some heavy grease on it when I put it back together. It'll probably keep the dirt and water out for most of its life. It's lasted this long. Okay, so we got the bearing in the back. Messing with that one kind of scares me because it's in good shape, and those style bearings, usually the way you get them out is you destroy them while you're trying. So I think I'm going to leave that one in. I might experiment on other housing. Let me show you a tool you usually use to get that bearing out. Generally, it's something like this you attach on the end of a slide hammer. So you fold it, slide it through the bearing, then open it up on the back side of the bearing, and then you slide hammer to pull the bearing out. But something like this is commonly used for rear axle bearings on a truck or something. Okay, so we'll take a look at our almost empty housing here. Definitely had a little bit of water on that outer side. The housing on the back still has a screw I was using to hold that board in place. Here's your hydraulic pump mounts. And this is the hole where that PTO engagement shaft went. And so far, the only thing I haven't removed is the races of that bearing. On all my other videos, I didn't remove the races either. Main reason is I'm going to clean them all up, and if they're in good shape, I'll just leave it in place. There's no sense in messing with it. Can't get focus there. There we go. All right, that's the end of this one. See you next time.